Good day, my name is H.B. Charles Jr. I pastor the Shiloh Church in Jacksonville, Florida. I am the host of the On Preaching podcast, the author of several books, including the new release, On Pastoring, that'll be available June 2016 by Moody Publishers. I also write a blog that can be found at hbcharlesjr.com. It is my joy to be with Dr. Stephen Thurston, who for 37 years has pastored the New Covenant Missionary Baptist Church in Chicago, Illinois. He succeeded his father, who served the church for 22 years, who succeeded his father, the founder of the church, who also pastored the church for 22 years. It is a joy to have Dr. Stephen Thurston with us.
Thanks, HB. Great to be here.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about yourself. I assume you were born and raised in Chicago, Illinois?
Yes, I'm a Chicago baby, and was born there in the home of my father and mother, who and 5 siblings, 6 of us coming up in that house, and we are all a part of the New Covenant experience since our birth. Being born in the church is a challenge, because you must come to a point where personally you accept Christ as your Savior. And to understand that was to come to that point in our lives where we actually experienced it. Knowing, however, that being brought up in a Christian home makes a tremendous difference. I say sometime in preaching that to come up in a Christian home and come to a point where you realize you have to accept Christ for yourself makes a tremendous difference. Being introduced to Christ in the home before you actually receive him in the church.
Yeah. So, of the 6, where do you fit in?
I'm second.
Second.
Yes,
Okay.
yes. I have a sister older than I am. She's deceased now, but she was a year older than I. And then I'm a year older, a sister on the other side. So I became kind of, in my dad's shoes.
Sure.
In the house. He kind of brought us up like that. And when my parents died, and my parents died 90 days apart.
Wow.
My mother died in 1978, and then my father died in January of 79. And being raised as the boy or the man to be in the house with my siblings made a tremendous difference at that point.
So preacher's kids have 2 attitudes toward being a preacher's kid. They love being a preacher's kid and all that goes with in church, and some just hate it, resist it, feel imprisoned.
Yeah.
Which kind of kid were you?
I was just glad to be one. The older members in the church would tell me after I got up to, understand conversation with them, that I was always ready to exclaim, when I grow up, I'm going to be a preacher. And in our house, of course, we played church.
Sure.
I mean, back in the day, we had good church in the basement of the house. So that was always what I wanted, and always what I leaned to. And most of my siblings were the same. I had one sister who we often would say, she's really not one of us, because she certainly resisted, being a PK.
Sure.
And all of that. But the rest of us, we were all glad to be PKs, and we embraced it.
So I just had my little sister who would play church with me.
Okay.
So she had to be the minister of music, the usher, and then she needed to shout on cue too. So
yes.
she had
Yes. Yeah.
She had to do
Yeah,
the
they
whole.
knew how to do that.
Yeah. So, at what point in your experience would you say you had a personal encounter with Christ and trusted Him for yourself?
I was 12 years old.
Mm-hmm.
In church, we all had to sit together. My mother sat on the end of the row.
That's foreign to a lot of people these days.
Yes, it is.
Uh-huh.
And we all had to come in and sit there with her.
Mm-hmm.
And we had to really act like we understood what was going on in the church.
Mm-hmm.
And I came to really start listening to my father preach at that age of 12
Yeah.
through another revivalist.
Hmm.
We had one of my grandfather's friends back in the day, Reverend A.A. McCardell from Houston, Texas,
Mm-hmm.
would do the revival.
Hmm.
And I actually started listening to him preach
Hmm.
in that revival. I can quote some of the things he said to this day.
Wow.
And then after the revival was over, I started listening to my dad more intensely.
Mm-hmm.
And it was through hearing him offer Christ and preach about the crucifixion of Christ and the centrality of Christ that I came to accept him for myself.
Wow. Praise God. Was that when you formally or publicly was it your parents' surprise, or did you already know and had been talking to them about it?
I had to talk to my mother
Gotcha.
about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it wasn't a surprise to them. She had talked to my dad about it.
Mm-hmm.
And they were just happy, and glad
Mm-hmm.
about it and ready to baptize me.
Amen. So you were, I assume, during those days, involved in all of the youth stuff.
Yes, I was involved in everything that the young people did.
Mm-hmm.
The youth choir, I
Mm-hmm.
sang in that,
Mm-hmm.
even though they said I couldn't sing then, and they still say it now.
Uh-huh.
I was president of the ushers
Mm-hmm.
because I looked at my mentor, who was the senior ushers president,
Mm-hmm.
and I wanted so much to walk like he walked and cut those corners when he would come down the aisle.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I sensed the opportunity to embrace leadership
Mm-hmm.
in the church. And Sunday school, going to Sunday school, back then we had the BYPU
Mm-hmm.
and all of that. So I was involved in all of that and coming to church all of the time. During my grandfather's affliction, he had a stroke and he was actually bedridden for 7 years.
Mm-hmm.
The church purchased a house right next to the church where he stayed. And I would come to church with my mother and siblings, and they would allow me to go next door. And I would sit with him through the whole service. He had a speaker box there so he
Wow.
could hear everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I had an opportunity to really see him in a different light.
Mm-hmm.
And my father said later that I was more like my grandfather than I was like him.
Mm.
And his spirit was just, in me and all over me.
Mm.
And I carried that into pastoring, into preaching. My
Mhm.
grandfather would preach all over the country. In fact, in this city, Jacksonville, I had the opportunity about 5 years ago to preach in a church where he had preached and done revival. And one of the deacons remembered him
Wow.
during his experience of preaching there. And that was just a great highlight
Yeah, I bet.
for me.
Yeah. So, at what point do you begin to sense a call to preach on your life, and at what point do you surrender to that call to preach?
in Chicago, I always knew I was going to preach, but in Chicago, we didn't have
if I may
young
interrupt you,
preachers.
but I associate with that because when I hear preachers talk about running from the call,
Yeah,
I have no association with
Right,
that. I just
right.
kind of knew
yeah,
all my life that
exactly.
I would ultimately end up being a preacher.
And that followed me, but I thought that I was too young. All the preachers I knew in Chicago were old guys. And we had one young preacher there in the city when I was growing up, Reverend Donald Parson. He was the only young preacher that I knew until I went to Bishop College. And when I went to Bishop College, and in my class, I'm talking to guys who were saying, oh yeah, I've been preaching for 12, 15 years. Now they're coming to college. They're 18, 19 years old, and they've been preaching all this time. It really shocked me that you could do that. And so under my pastor, that my dad took me to college and said, we'll be the church where you go, and this will be your pastor, Dr. Robert H. Wilson. And sitting there under him, I really saw myself doing what he was doing in that pulpit.
So, we'll get to Bishop in a minute. You didn't go to Bishop, though, already preaching.
No.
So how did you end up at Bishop? Your dad told you that's where
my dad told me that's where I was going. In the convention, he had a relationship with many of the pastors who were from Texas.
Gotcha.
And they said to him, you need to take your son to Bishop. And that's what he did. I had never heard of Bishop. It wasn't on my list.
Sure.
But he said, that's where you're going. And he brought me to Bishop College, and that's where I ended up.
So what did you go to study when you went to Bishop? Do you remember what your major started out as?
It was in religion.
Okay.
It was in religion because, again, I knew that I was going to preach. I just didn't know when.
Gotcha.
But I knew that I needed to have that background, and so that's what I chose from the beginning.
Dr. Robert Wilson is one of the nation's foremost preachers.
Yes, sir.
He pastored in this city.
Yes, sure.
The Bethel Baptist Church, succeeded by Dr. McKissick.
Right.
And he went to, what's the name of the church in Dallas?
St. John.
For those who don't know about the preaching ministry of Dr. Robert Wilson, tell us about him a little bit.
Dr. Wilson, or as he was affectionately called, Dr. Bob, came to Dallas at St. John, and my dad took me there to the church. He was friends with him and said, this is going to be your pastor. When I accepted the call, I talked to him first, and then I called my dad. And I was just enamored with Dr. Wilson's structure as a pastor. I started preaching actually under him. I came home and preached my first sermon, then came right back to school. And Doc was so organized with structure in the pulpit, and that just that I saw just captured me. And then a lot of the preachers there, they would, on Sundays, they want to go, oh, I'm going over here to preach. I'm going over here to preach. I didn't want to preach anywhere. I wanted to sit there and listen to him. And he had such structure in his sermons. He was going to see three things in every sermon he preached. Dr. E.V. Hill said at one point, when I had both of them doing revival at the church, he said about Dr. Wilson, he said, if we were driving down the street and saw an accident, Dr. Wilson would say, I see three things over there in relation to that accident. And then he would close his message, and he did not close it in what had become the traditional closing, taking Christ to Calvary.
Sure.
It was a part of his preaching, but I sat there and I heard him close a sermon based on what that sermon was really about. And so I learned how to do that, going beyond the traditional closing. As I said, taking Christ to Calvary, putting him in the grave and getting him back up, which of course is the centrality of our preaching. But I learned that through him.
Wow.
And it made a tremendous difference in my life, and the fact that I began to see the three things in any sermon that I preached.
Wow. So you've started preaching. You're in what year of school?
First year.
First year. And you're being mentored during those first years from afar by your dad.
Yes.
And a little more up close by Dr. Wilson.
Yes.
But you are also being trained in the Mecca of black preaching.
Yes.
Yeah. Tell us what your experience was and memories are of Bishop College. When I do these conversations, I've been fortunate to talk to quite a few guys who are products of Bishop College, and these are just the meaningful turning points and building points of their lives, and friendships and influences have remained on all of them, I assume.
Yes.
That's the case.
That is the case. That is the case. My life literally changed through my experience at Bishop in relation to preaching being the core of my presence and the presence of others who were preaching and growing in that light. And our experience with the professors there. It became historical to be under Dr. John Mangrum. And Dr. John Mangrum helped so many of us get beyond just the style of preaching and to get away from what he would call the ignorance that some of us embraced in preaching. And then to have someone to come beside him who was diametrically opposite of him, Dr. Harry Wright, who was just a tremendous mind and tremendous spirit in terms of preaching, and to give us an opportunity to be under them, be under the Old Testament professor, Dr. T.W. Thompson, who would not allow us to just take lightly our responsibility for being knowledgeable about Scripture. And so the experience at Bishop was just tremendous. And then among ourselves, nobody could help you as a student like another student preacher.
So here you're going to have to help us, because sometimes it gets in a blur, and everybody puts all of y'all in school together. Who are your contemporaries? Some were before you, some were after you. Who was with you during those years?
During those years, Cedric Britt, I met Cedric Britt from St. John. And he was there the day my father took me to the church. And he come walking down the hallway calling out my name loudly. And I knew I didn't know anybody there. But he did that to introduce himself, and we became friends from that point on. Larry Howard from Cleveland, Ohio. Jerome Kirby, who was from Detroit, Michigan, and brought into our relationship everything you wanted to know about Reverend C.L. Franklin. Oh my goodness. And then from there, there was Warren Stewart, who's in Phoenix, Arizona. Warren was the guy who was just so organized. Warren would write down on a piece of paper if he was going to buy a pop from the pop machine, 50 cents. And he was just so organized, and it helped him tremendously in his pursuit there. He was a smart guy there. Theodis Gant was there in the class that I was in. And we just had a great relationship. Those guys that I had the opportunity to meet became friends for life, and literally changed my life as a young man coming up there at Bishop College.
So students go to school and join fraternities, but it's just the Bishop thing is its own fraternity.
It is, really. When we would be asked, we made this up, but we would say real confidently that we're part of Preacher Sci-Fi. And that brought us together.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So when you finish at Bishop, you return home?
Yes, I did. I did. After we would sit some nights and talk about to each other what we wanted to do when we left Bishop. And all we wanted to do was preach and be able to pastor a church. That was our sincere desire. And we would sit around a lot of times just having that conversation. And that's all we wanted to do. That's all I wanted to do was go back home and assume the responsibility of assisting my dad in whatever way I could there at New Covenant. And I mean, we weren't thinking about, how great we could be or how great the church would be. Preaching and pastoring God's people was the desire that we all had. And that's what I had.
Wow. So you went home to serve with your dad? Went
home to serve with my dad. He served in the position of assistant pastor with his father, and then co-pastor with his father, because my grandfather felt that he would need to, I guess, develop a succession plan for himself and the church. And so he had the church vote to accept my father as co-pastor. And my father did the same thing with me. And when he passed away, being the co-pastor, that meant that the church did not have to have a process of candidates for the church. I remember when he passed that on his funeral program, I had them put Reverend Stephen John Thurston, pastor of the church. And of course, especially those who were his members thought that that was just out of, that it wasn't supposed to be like that. But he had told me, you are the co-pastor of the church, and when I am no longer here, you will be the pastor, and the church will not have to vote you into being the pastor. Now they can vote you out as pastor, but you are the pastor, and that's the way the succession went.
So how long were you back from school serving with him before you became the co-pastor?
I came back home in 1975, and my father passed in 1979, so that was 4 years.
4 years.
Yeah. And one opportunity, there was a church out in the suburbs that wanted me, they were vacant, wanted me to come preach, and they called my father, and at first he said no. And they wanted to know why. He said, because he's going to be the pastor here at this church, and so don't y'all think about trying to call him at all. And he could be like that.
Sure.
Yeah.
So tell us, for those watching who don't know of your grandfather's ministry at the church and your father's ministry at the church, tell us something about what kind of preachers they were, what kind of leaders they were, and in what ways you think they most directly influenced you.
My grandfather was a part of the Great Migration from the South to Chicago, and he came to Chicago as a deacon, and he was a faithful deacon in the church. He was one of the praying deacons in the church, and from that, the church under the pastor who was there had a split. They had an argument and actually put that pastor out. And my grandfather had started preaching under him, and so he carried to the pulpit a strong voice, and he carried to the pulpit preaching in the fashion of illustration. My grandfather would preach and illustrate in his preaching who he was literally preaching about. If it were the Hebrew boys in the fiery furnace, somewhere in that sermon he would make himself them. And then he would close his message with a strong voice in preaching. And he was a people lover. He loved the people and embraced the people in that light. My father, after going to World War II, he became the first pastor there in Chicago with a degree. He went to Howard University, got his degree, and of course he was more organized in the administration of the church, in the structure of the church, because of his degree that he had, and and his military experience. So he brought that to the church and actually moved the church from where we were to where we were then, which was a big step because Chicago, being so polarized in neighborhoods, all of us on the south side lived between 31st Street and 63rd Street. My dad saw vision for the church at 77th Street, which was outside of that secluded area. And my grandfather allowed him to actually make the move up the church from there to 77th Street. And many of the older pastors and many of the older people said that was going to be the demise of our church, because black people were not supposed to move past 63rd. He was very committed to social justice. He was on the board of SCLC. He opened the door of our church to Dr. King. In that time when the old man Daley was the mayor of the city, and he stood up and declared to the black preachers there that they were not to allow Dr. King there. He said that to Reverend Clay Evans, who was in the midst of building a new church, and the mayor had the power to stop the building, which he did, and that church sat there in its steel and couldn't go any further because no bank would loan him any money at all.
Wow.
So Reverend Evans, my father, Reverend Stroy Freeman, some of the other pastors, they accepted Dr. King, and they marched with him, and they brought him to Chicago to deal with social justice there. So he gave us that perception, and the church began to flourish in the move that he made and all. And then when I accepted the call, he said to me that I had a lot of my granddaddy in me. I had the stronger voice. My dad didn't have as strong a voice as my grandfather did. And that I liked preaching. I guess, cared about it or liked it so much more. So I guess I got a blend of my grandfather and a blend of my dad, and was able to put it together and lead the church, which is a generational church, into being a strong church with 3 generations there.
That's great.
Yeah.
So let me circle back around those days one more time. You spend years in Dallas, which is a hotbed of preaching.
Yes.
During those days, Chicago as well.
Yes.
These are your formative preaching years. Who besides your grandfather and father, and you mentioned Dr. Wilson, who were the other preaching influences from your experience in Dallas and those formative years in Chicago?
Well, Reverend Donald Parson, again, he was probably the youngest pastor when I came back home, and very innovative and creative. And the gift that he had in his ability to craft words within his message helped me tremendously.
Yeah.
Dr. E.V. Hill became a mentor to me because of his style of preaching, and that he accepted evangelism as being a base for the church and the ministry of the church. He gave me that sense because when I was younger, I was a supporter of the Billy Graham Crusade. I remember my first Bible study came through a brochure that I got at the Billy Graham Crusade, where you would take it home and you would have to write in, fill in the blanks from, certain scriptures and books in the Bible. And his evangelism was something that I embraced from Dr. Hill as being a very foundational piece in my pastoring there. I remember we brought the World Christian Training Center to the church because that was something Dr. Hill had, and he wanted to get all over the country.
Wow.
And then there in Chicago, Reverend Clay Evans as a pastor, and the way he pastored.
So
people.
that name may be a surprise for people to hear outside of Chicago, because outside of Chicago, people only know that name because of gospel music.
Right.
But what they don't know is that this was a pastor.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And he would say often that he was a preacher first and a singer second. But you're right, many people just saw him as a singing preacher. But he pastored the Fellowship Baptist Church in such a powerful way. And his preaching, biblically based, very traditional, but very, very strong in the lives of the people that he pastored. And I just, I revered Reverend and just took so much that I saw him do back to the church where I was.
Wow.
And it was strong in that light. So those are really the individuals who had a very impressive opportunity in my life.
So before we came on camera, I mentioned, that my line is that I had the burden and blessing of pastoring my father's church. You pastored your father and grandfather's
Yes,
church.
sir.
What was during those developmental years? You're 37 years in now, but what were those early years like? This is not just your grandfather and father's church. This is your first pastorate.
Yeah.
You're still, how old are you when you take the realm?
26.
26, young man. What is, so this is also the people who saw you grow up and all of
Yes.
that, all of those dynamics that go along with that. Just what was your experience in that regard?
It was quite interesting. I guess I should say, one, it was not as bad as my dad's experience.
Okay.
Because he's following his father, and there's nothing at all before him
Gotcha.
to show him how to do that. And he had, I remember him talking about many, many challenges in that relationship. Coming as the third generation, he had already kind of set everything in motion through how he followed his dad. So it wasn't as bad. The members, many of them expected it, and many of them embraced it.
Gotcha.
And so there was no fight or struggle at that point. But being different than him, my grandfather's members were my cover.
Wow.
They were all of the older members of the church at that point. And my dad's members were the challenge.
Wow. Okay.
But my grandfather's members would stop them from, really messing with me. Their position was, that's Elijah's grandson. And y'all have got to leave him alone.
Wow. Okay.
And they became my cover in that relationship. And the challenges I had mostly with my dad's members in that way. And they were more of a struggle with me, but I stood up to them. My father told me before he died, he said, listen, I have done everything for you. I have turned the church over to you. If you allow them to take it from you, that's going to be your fault.
Mm-hmm.
And I remembered that. And so I remember my first deacons meeting I had, and in that meeting it was all about what did your dad do, and what was he doing over here, and what was he doing over there. And I sat there and listened to them, all of them much older than me. And we want this, you know, turn it over to us. And my statement to them was, listen, I'm as much man as any one of you here. You know, I'm shaking all while I'm saying this. And you need to go to the cemetery where my dad is. Obviously, you need to ask him what you asking me. Because I don't have any answers for you at all. So I kind of started like that. Dr. Hill had said to me in counseling, now, however you start, that's the way you're going to have to continue.
Sure.
And I felt the pressure of what my father had told me on me. And I just really, I was living next door in the house where my grandfather had lived. My dad got them to fix the house up for me to live there. So I would often just come next door and spend time in prayer in that sanctuary by myself with God. And anything that happened that was a benefit or blessing to me or the church, I had to give God thanks for, because I knew absolutely nothing about what I was doing.
Did you start a family at that house next door to the church? Or were you moved beyond
started a family right there.
Wow.
I was married 1 year when I became pastor.
Okay.
And Stevie had been born.
Wow.
And all, but that's where that started right there.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I've never asked this question in an interview. Came to my mind while you were talking. But there is a point in a longer pastorate. And a lot of times you get called to pastor the church, but you're not the pastor of the church, whatever the circumstances.
Right.
You are given an opportunity to become the pastor.
Yes.
And sometimes that process does not succeed and you end up somewhere else.
Yeah.
Or you break through. And it's the weirdest things that makes that happen.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's a fight. Sometimes it's the death of some strong lay leader. But at a certain point, you get to a point where you kind of begin to sense, I'm the leader. I'm the pastor now. At what point, how long were you in your journey where you felt like you had turned the corner? This is not just your grandfather, dad's church. I am leading this church.
Again, my mentor, Dr. Hill, had a lot to say about just that. He had already told me that it's going to take, he said, it's going to take 3 years and you'll be at this point. Another 2 years, which will be 5, you'll be at this point. Another 2 from there at 7 years, you'll be at this point. And the Lord's going to give you the church at this point.
Wow.
And I was amazed how accurate Dr. Hill was in that. So 7 years, it literally took that long to actually become pastor of the church. And I just followed his directions in that light. But it was about 7 years when God actually put the church in my hand. And I remember earlier, though, in my first year, the deacons, they kept challenging me and all of that. And I was ready to go to a deacon's meeting, and I was going to say to them, listen, I don't have to take this. I don't have to pastor here. I can go somewhere else where I don't have to go through with this. And I remember saying that in the deacons' meeting. And of course, they were very quiet. They didn't say anything in response to it. And the Lord whipped me so from making that statement. And literally, as if you're talking to me right now in the Lord's voice, said to me, don't ever say that again.
Wow.
Here. This is where I have planted you. This is where you're going to be. And this is what you're going to do. So I never said that again. And from there, it just grew to those 7 years. And it actually became a reality.
I had a similar experience. You know, we all have things when we look back over ministry that we regret. And this is not a public thing, but my chairman of deacons and chairman of trustees stood over my desk. They wouldn't sit down. And they're pointing their finger down at my first church, about 20 years old. And they basically threatened to put me out. And I was just, my ego got engaged. I just wasn't going to let them punk me. It's like, no, I'm going to put you out. And I just wasn't going to let them.
Right.
And I just felt like the Lord whipped me after that. For just trying to take matters into my own hands.
Yes, sir.
Those are not all the time public moments that people see, but the Lord has a way of chastening us. So from Los Angeles, my father was good friends with Dr. Hill. And this is another, you've been blessed to have legendary, larger than life influences over the course of your ministry. This is a name that many people will know who watch this. Some may not. Tell us a little bit about Dr. E.V. Hill. And just tell us, you know, what you think. He's been with the Lord for a while now. But I'm in Southern Baptist circles a lot now. And if they know a black preacher, they know E.V. Hill. This guy was just able to cross into whatever tribe. And God was just using him. I mean, he was very much National Baptist and very much Southern Baptist. And could end up on TBN. And
he made the motion for Dr. King to become the president of SCLC.
Wow.
He would say that often. Yes, he was. And that's what really amazed me about him. He could be everything to everybody to win some.
Wow.
And he was such a literal preacher in relation to the Word of God. I could see him being that person who in the text, in the narrative, he became those individuals when he preached. And that's what just really captured my attention about him, and how he could cover so much ground. It really didn't matter what individuals thought about him. He would stand for what he believed. And he really put that in me as a leader. And Doc was just, I mean, he was just amazing. I took a lot of that, which he did. I remember at the church, Doc had the biggest bulletin that any Pastor, whatever happened. I mean, it's a book. Every week, a book with everything in it that he had done during that week. I mean, his stewardship was tremendous. On Monday, I went and saw Sister So-and-so, and
Wow.
he would make a commentary on everything that he did. And not only did he put it in a book, he would spend that time, 30 to 40 minutes, in his observations at church on Sunday. And it really amazed me how he was able to just do all of that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, you have been a model for me since the days of my young ministry, because, among other things, my models are men who make a priority of the pulpit. Pastoral ministry involves
Yes.
100
Yeah.
different things,
Yeah.
but it was never designed for those 100 things to put the ministry of the word on the back burner. The influence of pastoral ministry happens by preaching and teaching, I believe.
Yeah.
And your passion for the pulpit has always been an example for me. Just how was because not only are you a learning leader taking over for your father, you're preaching weekly. And you're taking a pulpit. How did you see? Have you been seeing your preaching develop over those years?
Let me say it has changed. And I had a young minister ask me that question a couple of months ago. Has my preaching changed? And of course, I had to categorize it, but it has. I can preach now maybe a sermon or sermons that I preached 20 years ago, and it's altogether different because I've committed myself to growing, in my preaching. And I think any preacher that does not grow in their preaching, they really erase themselves from being effective and for really being able to help individuals.
Sure.
So I've learned from my own preaching that there is a need to become more adaptable to where we are, what we're trying to do. And again, I have always had the opportunity through Dr. Wilson to see in the text what hasn't been seen before. And that has always been my goal, one of my goals in preaching, to see in the text what has not been seen before. And I don't mean that in a way to take the text and misinterpret the text,
Sure.
take it out of context, but to actually see that text in relation to where people are and how they should be able to see
Sure.
that text come alive in them. And that's always been my pursuit. What can I say about this text that is not just blanketly obvious?
Sure.
Dr. Wilson would always,
The clearer
he'd
water
always-
comes when you dig deeper.
Yeah.
Anybody can scoop up
Right.
shallow water.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So that's just always been, a goal of mine. And when I was blessed to meet you
Mm-hmm.
as a young preacher, and even as a young pastor, I saw so much of your thinking
Mm-hmm.
in myself when I was that young,
Sure.
and it really captured my attention,
Mm-hmm.
and I just appreciated you so much
Mm-hmm.
for being able to do just that,
Wow.
to take us into a text
Mm-hmm.
and bring up something that I haven't seen that before.
Sure.
Yeah,
Yes, sir.
man.
Very kind of you. So, let me ask talk a little shop.
Okay.
Are you what has been your pattern over the years and how has it changed? Some guys do their homework and don't kind of write anything, just extemporaneous. Some guys write a structured outline. Some guys are full manuscript. Some guys are full manuscript, don't take it to the pulpit.
Right.
What has been your pattern over the years, and has it changed over the years?
No, it hasn't changed.
Okay.
I'm not a manuscript preacher, never have been.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a lazy writer.
Okay.
And I have been, and again, I guess I've seen it more out of Dr. Wilson,
Mm-hmm.
who was going to have, obviously, 3 points in his sermon. He was going to have an introduction, 3 points, and a closing. And that's what I have. I started like that
Mm-hmm.
and continued like that.
Mm-hmm.
I do preach usually out with an outline,
Mm-hmm.
just as I stated. And I've been able to, from what I've read, get in my mind. One of my Sunday school teachers, and he was really tough on us with this. He would say all of the time that God is not going to bring anything to your remembrance that you have not studied. You know,
Sure.
Some preachers look at that. Oh, the Lord He's going to fill my mind.
Mm-hmm,
But the Scripture says the Spirit will bring back to your remembrance, which means it's got to have had an introduction at
Sure.
some point
Sure.
prior to that. Only what you have put in your mind.
And I say, you know, a lot of preachers talking about the Lord just dropped this in my spirit, but He'll never drop the meaning of a Greek word in your spirit.
Right.
You gotta look that up.
That's right.
Right.
And that comes, you know, in a lot of preachers just being lazy.
Sure.
They're just lazy.
Mm-hmm.
But I have always looked for the opportunity to read,
Mm-hmm.
and get that in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember in the church when I first started pastoring and preaching, we had to go through that as pastoring people, especially distractions.
Mm.
You know, how people can be, and they can be doing something while you're preaching.
Yeah.
They can get up and walk out and all of. So we had to go through that because I'm thinking, and at the same time, I'm uttering phrases that are in my mind that must be recaptured. And at the same time, you're distracting me
Yeah.
and taking me away from that.
Right.
And that's how I literally trained myself so that I would be able to do that, which is not the easiest thing in the world, because you're uttering phrases and you have to recapture them.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm noticing, and I noticed this in Pastor Wilson, as he got older, he came to a point where he had to write more down because he was getting to that age where he couldn't do it as fluid as he had been doing it before. And I'm going, kind of coming through that point now where, you know, it may not be as fluid, or I will start phrases and then lose what's supposed to come next in the process. So.
And I'm just, as I'm getting older, I'm just less neurotic about it.
Yeah.
If I need something in front of me, I need to be clear, and I don't want to sacrifice clarity for style.
Yeah.
So, my exposure to your ministry is through your pulpit ministry outside of your own pulpit.
Yes.
And this is not a privilege every pastor has. A lot of guys would love to be invited places to preach and are not.
Yes.
And that's not necessarily an indictment on their ministry.
Right.
There are others who, throughout their ministries, there's been their pastoral assignment and a larger itinerant ministry at the same time. That has been your ministry for much of your pastorate. What would you say about just the juggling of those two worlds, which is not always easy? It's not easy.
Right. I do look at it as a great opportunity. As I mentioned earlier, it wasn't anything that I wanted. I'm going to be this preacher that preaches all over here and there. All we wanted when we got out of Bishop was to have a church.
Have you a preaching station?
That's right, where we could preach. That was it. But Dr. Wilson told me at some point, he said, the Lord is going to use you to really carry your ministry outside of New Covenant.
You mentioned your grandfather preached all over the country.
Yes.
Was that so with your father?
Not as much.
Gotcha.
Not as much. He did not do that as much.
Okay.
But it was really an opportunity that came, and I embraced it and I accepted it. And then I started learning some of the rules related to it. And
such as?
I remember preaching for Reverend Jasper Williams. And before we went out, he said to me, now, Steve, you don't have to preach nothing new. In fact, he actually said, don't preach anything new. When you on the road like this, man, you preach what you know.
Gotcha.
And I accepted that.
I know that.
And I received that. And so much of my preaching out was not designed as much as pastoral preaching. It was biblical preaching and preaching that would help. And so I did much of that when I was out, when I would preach out and preach in different places. And I never, ever used too much of series preaching, because I did series preaching in the church, and it was very helpful in terms of pastoral preaching. But I did not preach those sermons too much when I went out and preached around.
I mean, there's a certain batch of sermons I have that are, I have a general philosophy. If it's good enough to feed my family, it's good enough to feed your family.
Yeah.
But within that, I have a smaller batch, because there are things that are just meant for the congregation
That's
that
right.
I serve. There are things I can't say in another pulpit.
Right.
Because I have a stewardship here that I must say. So, yeah.
Yeah.
So, in regards to that, though, what kind of series did you do? Did you do long series, short series, book series?
I've done them all. I've done them all. Some topical in relation to the church. Dr. A. Lewis Patterson, who was a mentor also, said to me at one point, if there's anything you really, really want the church to do, you're going to have to put it in a series of sermons.
Wow, that's good advice.
And I did that and saw great movement. I remember a series, which was a long series on worship, but it was one of the most helpful series at the church with the members in terms of what they did in worship. I remember I took the call to worship back then, and we agreed that if any aspect of the call to worship did not bring glory to God and it did not bring us to a better worship position, we were going to actually take it out of the order of worship. And we ended up doing that. But I took each thing that we did in worship and did sermons around that. And my style of preaching, if I can call it that, became more of how to.
Okay.
This is how we are to do this, and this is why definition, and this is why demonstration would be in many of those sermons. So
that's right.
I did a lot of that. I did some biblical exegesis, took a book and went through the entire book in the Bible. Also that was tremendously helpful. And some of them just long. The book that I did put out was a book on the series of sermons called the Beatitudes.
Gotcha.
Which actually took the alphabet and went from A to Z. Be attentive, be brave, be content. And we went through the whole alphabet. Now that was a long.
What was the name of that series? What's the name of the book?
The Paintbrush of Your Mind. Attitude is the first word in it.
Is the
Paintbrush of Your Mind.
Is that book still available?
Yeah.
Where would those watching this find that?
They can get it from the church. They can go on the website, newcovenantmbc.com, and get it, or they can call the church and we can get it for them from our bookstore.
Good deal.
There at the church.
All right, and we'll have the information on the video here. Thanks for sharing that.
Yes.
So you have had a perch of almost 40 years of pastoral ministry, and you have had itinerant ministry, traveling, denominational leadership. How have you seen in the 40 years, the assumption of the question is, preaching has changed?
Yeah.
Just from your perch, how has preaching changed over these 40 years? As you just, from whatever your vantage point is, and what are you seeing that is encouraging to you and troubling to you?
I've seen a distance from the centrality of our preaching. Of course, in preaching Christ, as Paul says, and Him crucified. I have also seen the lack of stewardship in relation to, I guess I can say, a number of our younger preachers toward education. They won't go to school, and you can tell that they have not been to school in their presentation of the gospel. I preached a couple of weeks ago, and one of the pastors said to me, "You didn't use one cliche in your sermon," and that's what I appreciate about you. I think that too many of our preachers have picked up cliches. They have taken a shallow approach to the scripture. They have limited knowledge of the scripture and won't really push themselves to get some education. They really need it, and we're just being overwhelmed by a lot of Bible-less preaching. When young guys ask me, "Doc, what are you reading?" Well, of course, I read books that will help me to present a strong message in relation to the scripture, but I also read the Bible. And I think that reading the Bible and being able to present what's in the Bible is still our responsibility and our strongest sense of communication with the people of God in that life.
Yeah, that's great. I totally agree with that. So I am always in love with pastors who have long pastorates. It's just, my father served the church for 40 years. My adopted dad, call him Pop, John Reed, more than 4 decades. My pastor and father in Los Angeles, Melvin Wade, more than 4 decades. And men like John MacArthur, who's influenced me, and others many have been men who have planted a flag and held on. That is not everybody's calling.
Yes.
And it is not easy. What have you, well, John MacArthur was asked, what was the key to his long ministry? His answer is, I've just outlasted all of my critics. So,
yes, he sure did say that.
So, but what would you say have been some of the keys to a long pastoral ministry is seasonal. And over 4 decades, there are ups and downs, ebbs and flows, winter and summer. What would you say have been just keys to longevity, if that's
the definition of long suffering would have to be at the very top of my list. It's something that you become. We talked earlier about becoming the pastor. And I think that goes to the extent that that's who you are. In fact, those who have gone before me have given me that picture that you are pastor. That not a title, but your very being, yourself, you are pastor, where people on the street who aren't even a member of the church call you pastor. When you walk into a hospital and you're able to minister to a member, and then the person that's in the other bed says to you, "Pastor, would you touch me? Would you pray for me?" And that God gives you that as you become that, and you really can't escape it.
Wow.
That keeps you right there.
Sure.
The children call you pastor.
Absolutely.
And her husband calls you pastor.
Sure.
And that can give you the motivation to continue.
My father was a major preacher. And to this day, he's been with the Lord since 1989. I could go somewhere and still bump into a former member of Mount Sinai in Los Angeles. And as much as he is known as a preacher, that is never what they mention to me.
Yeah.
They mention, your dad baptized me, your father married my parents.
Yes.
Being
Preach
a,
the funeral.
those moments of ministry,
Yeah.
where you become a pastor, not just the pulpit work, not to diminish it, but the times that you are there serving, those are small touches, but those are things people don't forget.
Right.
Yeah.
And I guess one of the persons, Reverend Clay Evans, he just really got that in us, because we would hear him stand in that pulpit, and we would see him pastor, just standing there. I mean, from saying, critiquing something that went on in the service, to really getting somebody together, and saying, that's what I'm here for. I'm telling you this because that's what I'm here for. And to just to watch him pastor people. He would say to us sometime, if you're not pastoring, you're pestering them people.
That's great.
And he just really drilled that in us. Yeah.
So you served as the president of the National Baptist Convention of America.
That's correct.
You did you aspire to that as a young pastor? I know there's some who want to be moderator, state president. Was that on your radar as a younger man?
It did as I grew in the convention.
Got you.
It did become that for me. And being the youngest, I was always the youngest. But that's because I didn't want to just be in the hallway.
Yeah.
Whatever I've been blessed to be a part of, I've always had within me the aspiration to become the leader.
Okay.
In whatever area it was. And with the convention, it was. And once you start understanding the whole structure of convention life and all of that, you either embrace it or you leave it alone and walk away. And I guess I embraced it and had an opportunity to do that at the level in my own state convention, and then at the level in the national. And I was the youngest. At that point, I was 50 years old, and being president at 50 was a great milestone because just everybody else was just older.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, my question is a more generic question, 30,000 feet question.
Okay.
Looking down, you have been a part of denominational life all of your ministry. We've talked about preaching changing over the years, pastoral ministry changing, but denominational work has changed. Yes. Now we are in a day where really that was the only avenue for education, training, fellowship at a day. Now you have these fellowships and movements and all of these things. And then you have conferences where a pastor over the course of the year has to set a budget and think, do I want to go to a conference or to a convention? Just from a 30,000 10,000-foot vantage point looking down on the landscape, what is your view of the state with a changing young preacher's mindset of convention work in general, with all of the competition, with its strengths and weaknesses? What is your perspective at this point?
And I'm going to sound like the current president of the USA Convention,
Okay.
whose focus is on developing the convention to be a more denomination in its structure and in its relationship to the church. I think that the conventions somewhere got into becoming just a larger church
Okay.
and not a denomination that can help draw us closer together in the things that we agree on
Sure.
and agree that we should be doing. Baptists are free, or as I had some pastors who would remind me all of the time when I was president that the autonomy of their individual church
Sure.
and them as pastor should never be infringed upon from a convention position. And I did not agree with that wholeheartedly, because I felt even as Baptists, we're free. I mean, a train is free to move,
Sure.
but it's guided by some tracks
Right.
if it's going to get anywhere. And that it's really a shame that a Baptist church does not have any resources that say, when this happens in your church, here is a way for you to handle it. Here are resources financially, along with a stewardship plan
Sure.
for how you can do this, how you can be successful. And because of that, there's nothing that really ties these young guys who are pastoring and who want that
Sure.
and need that.
Yeah.
And I think that the convention is going to end up, if it doesn't get on that track, it's going to end up just being isolated and moved away.
Sure.
And I mean, we who's flying people across the country to take a class when that, from my vantage point, was always the responsibility of that local pastor to his church and his people. And we built up this great big Congress that has no relationship with what goes on in that church, to a degree now. One of the conventions does. I mean, they put together educational information that you can take and ultimately get certificates and all of that. But in most of our conventions, we don't do that. And until we do, you know, what is a young person going to do who raises the question, how do I know when I've been called? What do we do with the ministry of deacons, the ministry of trustees? How come I'm a member of this convention and I can't write a check and get information on all of this that can help me from the beginning to the end in relation to my church? And I think we're going to really just lose it.
Sure.
Yeah.
One more question. What year did your father pass again?
1979.
1979. The Lord moves your father upstairs.
Mm-hmm.
You become pastor of New Covenant Church. You're 25, 26 years old. You are a year or so into marriage. One child already.
Mm-hmm.
So fast forward to 2016, and somehow you have found a time machine to go back to 1979 and have an hour or so, few moments to chat with young Stephen Thurston, who is starting his ministry. What do you know now that you would say to young Stephen Thurston as he's getting started in ministry?
Wow. I don't know. I don't know that I would say much different than what I heard then. Relationships matter, and selecting the individuals who you bring into those relationships matter. That being said, because of those who went before me and were so wise, their place in my life would help me not to have made some of the mistakes that I made at that point.
Sure.
You know, we like to say we're young and dumb, and sometimes we are. I would like not to have to be young and dumb.
Sure.
And I would like to not have to make some of the mistakes I made coming along. And I would pour it out. I mean, just really pour it out to help not to make some of the mistakes that I made.
So you know the tricky part about that answer is,
What's that?
as much as we regret the mistakes, those mistakes become a part of our developmental process as well.
Yeah.
And I mean, some things
Yeah.
I learned maybe by having to trust God through storms that maybe then I wish I would have never had to go through.
Exactly.
Or learning from mistakes.
Yeah.
But you've been very generous with your time, and you have been very generous. As a boy preacher, you may not remember this. I'm sure you won't remember this. But this is a turning point in a national setting for me. We are in Oklahoma City, and you have preached the late night. If I remember, I think you preached that night, you can't touch this. For the into thy hands I commit my spirit. The church is so packed that I am sitting with my friends in the back of the choir stand. It is announced at the end of the service that Sunday afternoon I am preaching. And the announcement was the Sunday afternoon in the closing mass service, Junior is going to be preaching. Where is Junior? Stand up, Junior. And they let you close the service that night. And you mentioned that Junior was not going to be preaching, but Reverend H.B. Charles Jr. was going to be preaching. And I just felt like a kid who somebody treated as a grown-up for the first time. You were very kind to me at that very early age, and that has just not changed over the years, having preached for you over the years, preached with you over the years, and your example and your friendship and support has been a great blessing to me, and I just wanted to publicly say thank you for it.
Oh, God bless you, man.
Yeah.
God bless you. I have loved every minute of it.
Thank you very much.
And they did that to my dad more than they did it to me. And I remember hearing him talk about that, and you could sense the pain that he felt from the way the older preachers and older people talked him out of his name. And again, I know I keep bringing back Reverend Evans, but one of his pet peeves was to be disrespected. And he would often, when he would speak about something at the church, say, you don't have to like me at all, but you're going to respect me.
Yeah.
And that has always been, you know, in my heart.
Yeah.
To say, because I know how quickly it can happen.
Sure.
And how easily we can do it.
Sure, sure. Way cool. Well, thank you again for all you do, and we're praying God's continued blessings.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank
indeed.
you, Pastor.
Absolutely.
Bless you.
And thank you for watching.